Hello, and welcome to Seance, a Deathtrap Tomb Dungeon Design stream here on the Adventure Archive. My name is Ryan, and this is Sersa Victory, the one, the only master of Deathtrap Dungeon Design himself. How are you doing tonight, Sersa?
Oh, I am doing very well. It's been a busy week. Ran a world building workshop for the teens at my local library where we all collaboratively built a RPG campaign setting. It was pretty fun. So I'm riding high off that. Looking forward to talking about death tonight.
Had to rock the shirt again, but it is
There you
appropriate
go.
for our episode. Here we go. So real quick, this is episode 3. But probably do this beginning of every episode just in case people are catching it as their first one. What is Seance? What are we doing? And what are we doing tonight?
Yeah. So for those who are just tuning in for the first time, Seance is a stream slash podcast where Ryan and I are going to collaboratively build a death trap dungeon adventure in the style of something like the Tomb of Horrors. So each episode focuses on a different aspect of dungeon design. In the first episode, we did theme, the overall theme of the dungeon. In episode 2, the last one we did, we covered a unique mechanic or a gimmick, some kind of little mini game or something unique about the module that will affect the rest of the things that we design. And today we are going to be talking about death, and specifically the role of death in a death trap dungeon adventure. It may seem obvious, it's in the name, but there's some details there. How to design interesting deaths for a death trap dungeon, and a little bit of theory about failure in games.
Hi. I've been looking forward to this episode specifically because, theme obviously is a very important part of the dungeon, but since death is literally in the name, Death Trap Dungeon, I'm really excited to talk about it. We've talked about this a bunch, especially in regards to something like 5e, which sucks. In that the
Yeah,
fear
just slip
of
it in there.
death. Yeah, just had to just slide in there that you should play a better game. Is the fear of death is such a fun part of gaming, and the OSR and whether that's BX or the NSR, like whatever you play, I feel like there's a much more to me it's more fun when the fear of death is something that actually exists as opposed to something that's kind of more designed as like a hero game where really I feel like it's not really present as much. And especially when we talk about Death Trap Dungeons, and we've run a bunch of yours, things that you've written, a lot of stuff for Kobold Press, but with Mailed Fist and To Mercy, the having death mechanics in there, dying, having to be impactful and stuff like that is such a fun part of adventuring. And to me, that's one of the reasons that Death Trap Dungeons are so much fun. So it's gonna be really fun to talk about why it's important, how to make it feel good, and things like that. So very, very hyped for this episode.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the topic of your experiences with death in role-playing games, because that's something that I wanted to ask you about before we got into this, which was, what has been your experience either excuse me, as a player when your characters die, or as a GM where you are putting characters in harm's way and potentially killing them? Like, have you historically been a GM that pulls back when the player characters are in the red zone, or do you just let the dice fall where they may? Because what's challenging about designing a death trap dungeon, especially if you want to publish it in a marketplace, is that for reasons that are baffling to me that I won't really get into, death is kind of a controversial subject, right? And there are a lot of players who have a very allergic reaction when they hear that an adventure is deadly, particularly those who are more invested in, and I know it's going to be kind of a generalization, but the more story side of the house, right?
Mhm.
Which, no judgment there, it's all good. But I'm curious, like, what's been your experience with death in role playing games?
So, it really depends on system. You know what I mean? So I was late to the game. When I was a kid, I read like every D&D book possible, but didn't know there was a game, and my parents probably wouldn't let me play it anyway. So I knew a lot about D&D, and once 5th edition dropped in 2014, buddy, I had roommates at the time. A buddy got the starter set and was like, "Hey, want to try this?" And I was like, "Fuck yeah!" And now I've never looked back. Tabletop games is a huge part of my life now. Obviously, we run tabletop podcasts and stuff. But I started with 5th edition, and in 5th edition, you're really trained in a lot of different ways to not kill characters. You just hashtag DM tips Twitter and listen to some of the stuff. It's at the time it's just like, okay, cool, and then now when I look back at it, it's just like baffling how stupid so much of it is. But a lot of it is, you're basically writing your own shitty novel and then just guiding 4 people through it. People aren't supposed to die. 5th edition is designed to be a hero game where eventually you either battle or become gods. And people come to your table with 5 to 20 page backstories, super invested in this person because they put so much of themselves into it. So, depending on who the groups were and stuff, I was the kind of GM who would play like I would murder everybody and then not, you know what I mean? Just make them think they would die, or always have some type of Deus Ex Machina or something like that. Just depending on where it was. And even in our Evo campaign, we did have a couple characters die, and if someone died, they died, you know what I mean? But, a lot of times it was close or that was one where I pulled punches a little bit less. But overall, playing 5th edition, you become as invested in the narrative as the players become invested in the narrative. So a lot of times you find ways to not kill characters, but kind of make it feel like you are. Once I got out of playing 5th edition as much, and really honestly, the impetus to do a lot of different stuff was Mailed Fist, was your Cobalt Press adventure, where you ran it as a tournament at Andy's house. And I was like, this is people die. You're gonna, everyone dies. That's part of the tournament module thing, is just count deaths. This is a tally system. And it was really fun, and it really opened my eyes for a lot of different stuff. So in other systems, Victory Basic, when we ran that, I don't roll. That's another thing I love about 2d6. I can't fudge dice rolls when the players roll the dice, So if they fuck up and die, it's really on them, Yeah,
for liability purposes, it's the dungeon that kills them and not you. Legally, it's not your fault. It's interesting that you mentioned that too. There's a blog that I read a while back by someone named Ludite Sam, who has a series sort of laying out their critique of 5th edition, and a fair bit of it I agree with. But one of the things that I think really stood out to me was the ways in which the game can send a mixed message about the lethality that's expected. And so in I'm putting in air quotes, the gamer discourse, it's pretty widely held that, characters should really only die when it's narratively appropriate, that impending death should be pretty clearly telegraphed from a mile away, or prearranged with the GM and her players. But then the game's mechanics are filled with many ways to save or die, or be instantly killed or blown up. And so it's somewhat unclear reading the rules what it expects from you. But I don't really want to get into a discussion about that. Really, the reason I wanted to ask you was because I feel like, again, there's a lot of pretty reasonable, I think, reluctance to engage in games that put death front and center. There's a couple reasons for that. One of the reasons what you just talked about, where people typically get attached to characters in long-term campaigns. And so it's tough to yank them out of the story and then see what, have to fix the hole that's left. But also, death is sort of under-designed. What I mean by that is there are plenty of modules that are deadly, but don't necessarily put the same care into designing death to be fun and interesting and engaging in the same way they do for monsters, traps, puzzles, NPCs, that sort of thing. And that's what we're going to focus on tonight is how do we put the same amount of care into designing death, the most important aspect of Deathtrap Dungeon, that we would with any other element. And what I would like to do, if you're ready to jump into the Jamboard here, and I want to talk about what I call death first design. So we've got the jam. Do you have the Jamboard up? I don't have the stream up on my laptop yet. Perfect. So what is death first design? Death first design is a term I sort of use for myself when I'm designing tournament style Deathtrap dungeon modules. And basically, it's a way to remind myself to start before you do really anything else. We've got our theme, that's important. You need that, and you'll see why in a second. The unique mechanic, again, that's something you want to get out of the way first because you'll want to tie deaths back into it. But really, we're doing death before we do mapping, before we do really any monster design or trap design. Like this is, what, episode 3 of 12?
Right.
We're getting into it pretty early. And what I want to talk about is what is death first design? How does this tie into some of the theoretical writing about failure and loss in games? And then our activity tonight, which I think will be really fun, is we are going to come up with a number of gruesome, spectacular, engaging, interesting deaths that fit the theme of our dungeon. So, as I said, death first design, you want to start off by creating interesting ways for the characters to die because death needs to be fun.
Yeah.
In a Deathtrap dungeon module or a tournament because players are going to be dying often, right? It makes sense. And if those deaths are not interesting, if they're not engaging, if they don't do anything to make the players laugh or make them smile or make them freak out, it's just going to start to, it's going to grind down. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It can really start to feel like just a boot on a face. So what I want to do is jump over to the next slide here in the Jamboard. And hopefully you can see that book cover okay. There's a really, really great book that I recommend people check out. It's called The Art of Failure, an essay on the pain of playing video games. It's by Jesper Jewell. It's part of this series called Playful Thinking. There's a lot of really great books in that series. They're available on Amazon. They're relatively affordable. But what Jesper Jewell is doing in this short book is exploring what he calls the paradox of failure. And the paradox of failure he describes as this. One, in general, in life, human beings, we don't like to fail. We try to avoid failure or mitigate it where possible. Two, we experience failure when playing games, right? There are moments where our characters are going to die, or we fail to beat a boss or solve a puzzle or whatever. We fail in the game. And yet, number 3, we seek out games, although we're going to likely experience something we normally would avoid, failure, right? So this is the paradox that we try to avoid failure in our life, and yet we are drawn to games where we experience failure. And I want to jump ahead to the next slide here, where, despite this paradox, it's pretty well recognized that for something to be a good game, or even a game at all in the technical sense, we expect resistance and the possibility of failure. And I didn't include it because I didn't have a scan of it, but in the book, on this page, there is a picture of a button, like a Staples That's Easy button, and it just says press button to complete the game. And how most people would find that pretty unsatisfying. And that is true for tabletop role-playing games as well, specifically Deathtrap Dungeons, which are more similar to something like Descent or Hero Quest, these fantasy adventure board games, than something like Critical Role. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you mentioned this in your comments earlier in this episode tonight where you talked about stakes and danger. And this is really what Jesper Jewell is talking about here, is that a good game, we're not talking about, you know, a story focused game where it's really not about winning or losing. It's about collaborating to create an interesting story. Really, what we're talking about when we're designing a Deathtrap dungeon is we're designing a war game. We're
Right.
designing a board game, essentially. And an important part of that, for it to even be considered a game, is that we need to have death. There needs to be the real possibility of failure, not the imaginary one where the players feel like maybe they'll die, but they never do because there's hidden guardrails, but very real stakes. And I wanted to ask you about this. You touched on it a little bit, but I really want to draw it out of you more. Have you either played a game or run a game where you feel like there weren't really any stakes? There was nothing on the table. And how did that make you feel as a player or GM? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, again, we can go system by system, really. Like fifth edition, I mean, realistically, and this isn't even just knocking on it because I don't like it. Like there just never feels like there are stakes, because not only, like, at the end of the day, you could kill anybody at any time you want. Like you could drop a billion monster on your party and murder them anytime you want. But fifth edition has this ingrained system of like encounter balancing. So you're always going to favor the party, but also the death mechanic itself, where, like, if you hit 0, you don't die. You have to actually fail 3 times on something before you could possibly die, and that's if someone doesn't come do a lot of stuff to save you, right? Like, your party has to ignore you for 3 rounds, and you have to somehow fail 3+ times to die. It's difficult to die in 5th edition. So I know that in 2.5 years of GMing our Evo campaign, every one of those people hit 0 at least a bunch of times, but rarely did anyone ever actually die. So even as a GM, I didn't feel that there were a lot of stakes there. And as a player, anytime I've ever played, I never really was worried about it. Like even in like character creation, as a player, a lot of people will be like, you get to pick one like rare item or something. And I would always pick, like, it was like a periaptive wound healing or something like that, where like literally it basically makes it impossible to die. Like,
it just seals you up.
It seals you up. Like, you just automatically stabilize. So there's, and that's a game I've played more than any other game. I've played a lot of other games at this time, but like the amount of time I put into that game as a player or as a GM, I've never really thought that if things are relatively balanced, even if it is slightly more deadly, that my players are actually going to die. And as a player, I've never really had a fear of death. In other games, but then you go into it, like, again, like your tournament modules that we played, like, you're going to die. In a lot of OSR, NSR stuff, like, you're going to die. When we've played, even on some of our creator cuts in the early episodes, it's just like, we had, like in our first 3 episodes, we either ended immediately or like instantly died. When like John Davis came on and ran Helm for us, we TPK'd. In what would end up being like relatively like the final battle or whatever, but like, and we got our ass handed to us. It wasn't even like we like got to the final guy. It was like, no, there was like 4 other dudes. Like, we definitely got fucking murked. So it's just a difference in the style of game. Like in OSR games, I think there is an impetus on like, that's part of what it is. There isn't a ingrained balancing system, and a lot of times if you hit 0, you maybe get like 1 opportunity to save. What I mean? But in 5th edition, which is something I've run the most, exactly what, like, Andy saying in chat, the amount of death saves, the amount of opportunities to save, I don't ever really feel like there's stakes. And to me, 5th edition was always to me was presented as a narrative game. And that's what we always leaned into, was like, tell a story, because it's really hard to die and it's really hard to kill a character unless you're being like ridiculous. So if that answers the question a little bit, not really. Most of the time I played tabletop role-playing games, a fear of death was not part of the average experience.
Yeah, and one thing I want to be really clear about is, I do not want to give the impression that every game needs to be this sort of war gamey death trap focused thing. Um, but the reason I'm bringing up Art of Failure is for the kind of game that we are creating, which is focused on a more traditional definition of game, right? The way that Jesper Jewell would define it, which is essentially we have a rule system, we're buying into this rule system, and we expect resistance and obstacles and the real possibility of failure. We're not necessarily here to collaborate to tell a satisfying story. And if a player character's death is part of that interesting story, then cool. If it's not, it's not. Again, we're really designing something more similar to Descent or Hero Quest than Critical Role. But also,
Right.
um, I bring this up because, again, Jesper Jewell is talking about this paradox of failure. So, why do we enjoy this? Like, why is it that when we're sitting down to play a capital G game, right? Why is it that we feel sort of bored when there isn't a real possibility of failure, or in the case of an RPG, death? And he spends most of the book trying to resolve that paradox. And he takes kind of different theoretical tacks. And okay, if you look at it from this angle, here's what maybe these games theorists would say about it. There's some other theorists would say about it, but essentially trying to resolve that paradox. And one that really stuck out to me that I think is relevant to what we're doing tonight, if you jump to the next slide, is he talks about the way that sports psychologists address this issue of failure, and specifically the frustration with failure, right? Because in sports there's no we're not getting on the football field and putting on what we think is the most dramatically interesting game. It's a competition. There are rules, and people will win and people will lose. And how do you deal with that? And so the thing that Jesper Jewell says, citing sports psychology literature, is this idea of replacing frustration with curiosity. And, he writes here, I'm reading from the book, but, see failure as a learning opportunity and to play for the pure joy of the game rather than for whatever material or psychological gains we hope to achieve by succeeding. And we should care enough about winning to put in sufficient effort, but we should see learning rather than winning as the ultimate goal. So basically what he's saying here is, you want to play to win, do your best, but expect to lose. And when you do lose, don't get upset, but see it as an opportunity to learn. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So in the case of Deathtrap dungeons, I want to extend this phrase a little bit. So replacing the frustration with death with not just curiosity, but with excitement, with drama, with fear, with humor. That essentially what we're going to be doing tonight, and what I mean by designing death, doing death first design, is going, okay, the players are going to fail. They're going to die, and they're potentially going to lose, and they're going to die a lot. And what we need to do is make it so that we can grab that frustration the players might feel and turn it into something more interesting. Does it make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
And so if you want to jump to the next slide on the board here, you'll see this pretty dope illustration I copied out of Tomb of Horrors. But I have 3 little note cards here, and these are going to be our 3 our North Stars, or things that we're going to shoot for in tonight's exercise. And that is that death should be one or more of these things. It should be spectacular, which I hope I spelled right. You ever look at a word, you're like, did I spell that right? I'm looking at it.
Oh my God, all the time.
Yeah. Death should be engaging, and or death should be rewarding. So these are the 3 things that we're going to shoot for in our design tonight. So by spectacular, is the death wild? Is it gruesome? Is it something that you will leave the table and be like, you know what, I died, but that was cool. Like, like crashing a car into the wall and then just the car exploding, like just really over the top. For a death to be engaging, that means that on the back of the player character's death, was there some interesting interaction that happened? Did something change about the dungeon? Were the players forced to make a choice? or alter their strategy in some way. And then finally, rewarding. I'm a big fan of what I call like consolation prize type effects, where the characters, when they die, the survivors get some kind of benefit, right? And this can be,
Mhm.
again, a way to sort of stave off frustration where it's like, okay, well, my character died, but my comrades got something out of it, right? So by keeping these three principles in mind, this is really the essence of Death First design. Are there any questions about what we've talked about so far before we really get into our exercise for tonight?
Not really, but Andy said something that popped into my head too. Is a lot of this stuff reminds me of Dark Souls. Like it feels
Yeah.
like what's his name, kind of read these books or something before he did it. So much of what you're saying, I'm just like, yeah, you like. I don't. No one's gonna die more than they die in Dark Souls, but people love the shit out of those games. But every time you die, you learn how to get a little bit farther and a little bit farther and a little bit farther.
Yeah.
Um, and
Well, I'm glad you brought that up for two reasons. The first is that Miyazaki, the creator of the Soul series, he's been very adamant that the experience that he's trying to create with his games is one of overcoming adversity. And this is why he's been very resistant to calls to put a quote easy mode uh, in Souls games, which is, I agree with his decision not to do that.
yeah,
And he says pretty bluntly, is like, I want to create a feeling of having overcome adversity. And there's a couple other games. I think there's Shovel Knight. I have a book about that where Derek Yu, the creator of that game, I could be wrong. I might be misremembering, maybe a different game, but talking about how the feeling of overcoming difficulty was something that he wanted to preserve because you get those really high highs and those really low lows, right?
yeah.
And there's a really great line here. Let's even find it in Jesper Jules' book where he is talking to a friend and she's talking about her husband and how she knows which games are going to be his favorites, because if she comes in and says, "How are you liking the game?" and he says, "I hate it, I hate it, I fucking hate it," she knows that's going to be a winner, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and and second with with the Soul series, there's a concept. I didn't put it in the slides. I did maybe want to talk about it if it came up, and it has come up. But Jesper Jewell talks a lot about the difference between failure and punishment, right? And those may seem like, the same thing. They're related concepts, but there's a crucial difference. And with Dark Souls in particular, it's a game where you fail quite a bit, but it's not a particularly punishing game. And what I mean by that is when your character dies, and you're going to die a bunch, the setbacks are pretty minor, especially as you get to the later games in the series. So if you're killed by a tough boss, for example, well, what's the punishment? What's the actual thing that you suffer for losing? Well, your souls are going to get dropped in the area, which is typically not that big of a deal. Most players get a handle pretty quickly on, okay, I shouldn't be walking around with a million souls, right?
All right.
Um, Second, and again, this is more true in the later games, the bonfire or the site of grace is usually right outside the boss door. So there are some areas, especially in the older games, where if you die, there is kind of a hike back to the boss, and that builds up the drama. But really, when we're talking about punishment, what we're talking about is, okay, how much are we asking the player to give up because they lost, and how much of their progress are are we erasing, right? And in the case of a Deathtrap dungeon, failure will be common. There's a lot of death, but I've actually never really seen Deathtrap dungeons as being punishing, even though the little asterisk, the marketing materials for Necropolis of the Mailed Fist call it punishing. That's more, just that's more vibe. But really, it's like you respawn, and that's what we'll do, like for this one. And maybe you'll lose points if it's a tournament scoring thing, or there's some kind of, like in Chapel of Grief, when sisters die, they accrue grief tokens, and if it gets to a certain point, the game ends. But there's a lot of ways for them to, dismiss grief tokens or not lose tokens when they die. But basically, that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're doing death first design, when you're designing a Deathtrap dungeon, is you want to make failure common. You want to make failure fun. By failure, we mean death. But I'm not really into making it super punishing because that's where the frustration is. And, I might put it to you to talk about maybe your experience either with tabletop games or video games where, a game where you fail a lot, but you feel like you can get right back into the action.
Yeah.
And then potentially a game where you failed and it just sent you so far back or made you lose so much progress. You're like, fuck it, I'm not doing this anymore. Have you had experiences on either side of that spectrum?
Yeah, we played your tournament modules before. First tournament modules I played, and it was 5e. But like you said, when you die, you're losing points tournament wise, but your next turn you just respawn next to one of your buddies, like, and you just keep going. So it's more just like a fuck. All right, let's not do that again, and you keep going. And a game that I've played a lot more than any of the Souls games actually is Blasphemous.
Oh yeah.
Which, I mean, I wouldn't have beat if you weren't basically giving me clues the entire time. But similar concepts, like you have it's not Souls, Tears, that you drop when you die. You have to go back and pick those up, but it just goes back to, like, you don't go back that far. Like, it doesn't feel punishing when you die. It does just feel kind of like a setback, and that's cool because, like, you definitely die a bunch in Blasphemous, especially in some of the levels, especially since it's Metroidvania, and you just, like, you'll get areas where you're under leveled for where you're supposed to be, and you have to, like, cycle back to other areas and stuff. So yeah, it's not super punishing. I mean, games that I thought were so punishing that that I just gave up, I don't know. There's not a lot of games that I just gave up on. Like, I'm kind of I have to at least beat it, at least the first time. But I'm trying to think of, I mean, there's one game that I just didn't like, but it's just because I just didn't like it. It was,
right.
What was it? It was, oh my gosh, it's not Bloodstained. It's something like that. I can't remember what it's called. There was a couple versions of it. It's the one that Blasphemous did, like was going to do, like, they did like a dual output.
Oh yeah, Bloodstained.
Is it Bloodstained? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I loved the 8-bit one, and I hated the next one. I thought that, like, I just couldn't find stuff. I thought that, I don't know, I just did not like the way the map was put together, but it wasn't necessarily punishing in the way that death was. It was Metroidvania style.
Yeah. Just a little too crunchy. That one's, I enjoyed that game quite a bit, but I'm used to the, like, Japanese style, like, Mega Menu Metroidvania type games where you're fiddling around.
Yeah.
But yeah, and there's a lot of games that are seen as difficult but are not punishing in that genre. So a great example is Hollow Knight. It's seen as a challenging game. It's Metroidvania. It's Souls inspired. But even with the Souls formula, they've done a couple things to make it a little bit less punishing. So 2 examples that jump out at me. The first is where they do pits. Blasphemous is one of my all-time favorite games, probably in the top 3. But one thing that I wish they didn't do was the insta-kill pits, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's a great example of punishing, where it's like you hit the spikes and you die and have to go back, and you're just like, God damn it. It's so frustrating. Hollow Knight, I think, does it well, where if you fall into some sort of pit, you just take one hit and then you go back to the last platform you were on, right? So you're still failing, right? You failed to make the jump, but you're not asked to give up as much. And so the frustration that Jesper Jewell is talking about is lessened. And then in Hollow Knight, they also have these creatures that you can spend, I forget, like Geoad or something, where you can retrieve your, I forget what they're called, the souls equivalent, right? Without having to actually go down and get it. So if you lose your souls, like, really far away, or somewhere dangerous, you can say, you know what, I'm just going to spend 500 Geo and go to this NPC and have them return my souls for me. You know what I'm saying? And
Mhm.
that's what we're kind of talking about here with Deathtrap dungeon design that I want people who are listening and or watching to take away is that we're not trying to like brutalize the players. We're not competing with them. When you're designing a Deathtrap dungeon, really you're in a mindset like a video game level designer or a game show producer like Legends of the Hidden Temple. You want to create a fun challenge. And yes, the players will fail quite a bit. And that's part of the allure. Again, we seek these things out, even though we don't like failure in real life. We seek them out. And in fact, many games theorists say it's a necessary component. You're not a game if you don't have these obstacles. Um, so that's what I want to make clear off the bat is like, we're not trying to, as you said, drop a level 60 monster and kill him because that's absolutely something you can do. We are taking the mindset of level designers. How do we create an interesting challenge that feels brutal but is not punishing? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
So I think maybe before we jump into the activity, the second part, I don't have chat up. Any questions from the audience or any comments that you want to call out before we uh, move on?
Well, so Andy asked a question a little bit earlier, and it was, and I kind of talked about it a little bit. That he said in 5e death mechanics, it really favors the players. How was it writing 5e death trap dungeons, knowing that?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag because the death saving throws, I guess you could say, act as a buffer. But again, as Ludite Sam points out in their blog, there's a lot of things in the game that are all pretty unforgiving. A lot of save or die type things, especially spells. You kind of get around it in a couple ways. One, and I don't remember if I did this in Mailed Fist, but I know I do this pretty frequently where I just have a house rule where there are no death saving throws. Like if you drop to 0, you die and you respawn. There's actually two reasons for that. The first is to, again, create that feeling of deadliness and dread, right? Like, oh, like there is no buffer. Like if you're dropped to 0, then you're dead.
Can I
You
guess
know,
a
there's a
second?
res- Then the second is there's a respawn mechanic, and um, you want to get the players back in the action as quickly as possible because I don't love the unconscious rules in games
Uh,
because in practice what often happens is that players sit out. An example of this, I don't know if you remember this, they did like Wizards did a Stream of Many Eyes a couple years ago. It was like this
yeah,
big streamy type. I only caught a couple bits of it, but I remember tuning
yeah.
into the
They
Chris
do.
Perkins Meat Grinder.
Yeah, they do a release. It's like their announcement for like the schedule, like the planned release schedule for the year. They do like a big, con kind of thing where they'll have like a bunch of stuff and run games and do stuff like that. That was one of those.
Gotcha. Um, yeah, so I remember tuning into Chris Perkins. I think it was literally called like the Meat Grinder. So I was like, okay, maybe it's gonna be like a Tower of Gygax experience. And he talked about, um, these special rules for this particular event that were supposed to make it, feel deadly or feel more meat grindery. And I was thinking, okay, so did he just make it where when you get to 0, you die? But what ended up happening was he just raised the DC of the death saves to, I think, 15. And okay, on paper, yeah, that's technically deadlier and more dangerous because you have less of a chance to succeed. But what ended up happening in practice and why I didn't love the the stream was that it resulted in players just sitting out longer, right? Because they weren't advancing along the death track as quickly. They were kind of just stuck in this limbo longer. Um, so yeah, to answer Andy's question, sometimes you just have to house rule it, um, and just find those buffer spots and say, you know what, let's just cut this out so that when they get to 0, they die. You partner that with a respawn so they come right back in, so it's not as bad. And then yeah, part of it too is you have to just really understand what your game systems are built for. I think people are getting better about this, especially on the back of this OGL stuff where folks are branching out to different games. But for a long time, there was this idea that like, well, game systems don't matter. You can do whatever you want with whatever game you want. And I mean, I suppose given enough effort, that's true. But the reality is there are games that are better suited for different kinds of play experiences that push you towards different play experiences. And I mean, you're living proof of this. Like you have change in your tastes a little bit, and that's why you're moving away from fifth edition. You want to explore other games that do a better job of creating the experiences that you want. And so I don't know, when I was doing fourth edition stuff, it was kind of the same narrative where it's like, well, fourth edition characters are really tough and you can't kill them. And I mean, okay, I guess they're a bit more hardy than like OD&D characters, but you just get to a point where you do what you can with the system,
Yeah.
with as few house rules as possible. But eventually, I mean, this is why I really only play like basic expert these days. Is that seems to get the closest to what I'm looking for in terms of a rule system that supports the experiences I want. Hopefully that helps, Andy. That was a very long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I actually, I had, I mean, D&D has become like a lifestyle brand, but I had some death save stuff. One of the death save shirt I had actually had the Meat Grinder rules on the back.
Yeah.
And it did have that like raise the DC to 15 and like some other stuff or this or that. But I feel like, what I thought you were going to say for the second part, and maybe this is like, if there was a third, is a lot of the tournament stuff is timed.
Right,
So if you are running like 3 death saves like every single time, I feel like you're just like, taking time more and more off the clock when, you could easily just, I feel like you maybe didn't have it in mailed, because I kind of remember the players being like, nah, fuck it, I'll just die. Like, just give me a fail so I can just get back into the game quicker. So it's almost better to just be like, when you hit 0, you hit 0, maybe 1 death save and move on. But I had it on a shirt. I thought I had it close by, but that was it. But yeah, that is a huge reason I moved away from 5e, is like I got tired of not having the stakes. And as soon as I played a game where there were stakes, like even 5e, but with like Tomb in a tournament style, I was just like, this, to me, this is more fun. And I know I rip on 5e, and it's because it sucks. But people are allowed to have the fun that they're allowed to have. It's just, I want to have a different kind of fun. And one of the reasons we're even doing this stream is because this kind of stuff is fun for us.
Right.
And I also think it would be a lot of fun for other people if they were able to experience these kind of things a little bit more. Because 5e is not the world's greatest role-playing game. It's just the world's best marketed. So I know a lot of people that have only played 5e because it's the easiest to play and that it's the easiest to find other people to play with you. So it would be really nice if people saw this and were inspired to, if not try a different game, try a different style of play within 5th edition that's maybe less narrative and more stakes,
Yeah.
So,
and that's really, to be clear, our goal with this is to give you advice that you could really take to any game system. So, to go back to Andy's question a little bit, like, would fifth edition be my first choice to design or play a Deathtrap dungeon? Probably not. That being said, I tend to be pretty agnostic about game systems. Like, I have opinions. I'm like, okay, do I like this one or like this one? But I'm not as forthcoming about my opinions because I just don't think they really matter. I don't think anybody cares. What I want to do is give people system agnostic advice, and this goes back to some of the death save stuff. I remember seeing a couple little things like that in the past, and I've appreciated the sentiment, but personally never really loved them. I think for some of the reasons that we've talked about a little bit tonight so far, is that it's one thing to dial up the numbers and go, okay, you only get 1 death saving throw or none, or you crank up the DC, or monsters do more damage. I mean, those can be parts of your toolkit. Pardon me, but we're not going to talk about that stuff tonight. We're not going to talk anything about like do more damage or raise DCs. Really, where I think a lot of the thinking about death in RPGs and how to make them quote deadlier misses out are these things that I have on, slide 5 here, which is, are the deaths spectacular? Are they engaging? And are they rewarding? Right? Does that make sense?
right, absolutely.
So I think with that, let's go ahead and slide on over to the next page here in the board. You should see a bunch of note cards, right?
Yeah.
Or little sticky notes. So what I have here on the left are the 12 verbs, right? We're each one of these episodes is building on the previous one. So we have the verbs that we came up with in the first episode. these 12, 6 from our tomb theme, and 6 from our corrosion theme. On the right-hand side here, I have 8 different little interactions that fit into those 3 categories that I mentioned before, right? Spectacular, engaging, or rewarding. And what we're going to do for the rest of the time is come up with deaths by randomly pairing off a verb with one of these interactions on the right. Now, I have a little note here down at the bottom left for what these verbs really represent when we talk about death. So the obvious one is the method of death, right? So if I see like number 7, dissolve, we could say, hey, that's literally like a player is dissolving to death, right? Alternatively, it could be an action that leads to death. So I'm clicking on prayer here. Maybe there's a challenge. The players are supposed to pray. They fail in some way, and that causes their death, right? Or last, the verb could be an effect that happens because of the character's death. So I'm clicking mourn here. Let's say a character dies. We design some kind of interesting effect where maybe an NPC mourns the lost character, and that creates some kind of interesting interaction for the survivors. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what I want to do, why don't you go ahead and grab, I'll give you the death side. So grab a D12. I'm going to grab a
Okay.
D8.
All right.
I've got my little note stock up here on the right for episode 3. So go ahead and roll for us our first verb, and I will roll our first interaction.
We went straight to 12.
Boom. So that is expose or weather. And I rolled a 3. So I have foreshadow something later.
Ooh.
So the first death we're going to come up with, and again, we can lean on some of our notes from the previous episodes for, our monsters, our traps, those sorts of things, or we can create new ideas here. You don't have to limit ourselves to what we've put down so far, but we have expose or weather or foreshadow later. So why don't we start really quick by picking one of these 3 ways that the verb relates to the death. So it could be the method of death. So the player died of exposure in some way or was exposed to some kind of substance. It could be an action that led to death. So maybe the player characters were trying to expose or weather something. Or it could be an effect that happens because a character died some other way. So they were killed by a monster or trap. And on the back of that death, something in the area or in the dungeon became exposed or became weathered. Does that make sense? Like, which one of these speaks to you the most?
Think that. How did you word the first one again?
First, what?
The first option.
Oh, method of death. So that is
Yeah.
basically the character was died as a result of exposure or weathering.
I feel like I like that one. I feel like we've talked about like the weather exposure thing a couple of times in here in that like which one was it? It's the one where we talked about potentially maybe having to protect yourself with like the grave wax or something or your items
Yeah.
because if you go into like a room or something there's something in there that like instantly like dissolves or like rusts something out or like like it has some type of like corroding effect on everything that enters the room. So
Yeah.
I like the idea of keeping that as like a method of death where like maybe the first person that walks in doesn't realize that and like I can just imagine them just like dissolving or like melting away or doing something because of the exposure. um I like that one as like an actual a method.
Love it. So I'm making some notes here in the doc. So I also like the idea of using that cool corroding room, the weathering room. So we have a character death where they enter this corroding room. They fail to protect themselves with the wax. Failed to protect themselves. I cannot type. So this is typically where a lot of dungeon designs stop. Like, oh, you fail and you die, right? But this is where the money happens, is when we bring in these additional interactions. So this death has to foreshadow something, right?
Mhm.
So imagine it, you're the GM, you're running this encounter, the character walks in, a dramatic moment where they're like, oh, did I protect myself? No, you failed to protect yourself in the right way. You didn't use the wax, or you put the wax on wrong. And your character is exposed to this corrosive thing and you just disintegrate, right? Now we need to foreshadow. So how do we use this moment of death to foreshadow something later? And we can really do anything here. Like it's a it's a magical fantasy world. So like an example that comes to my mind, we don't have to use this, I'm just kind of putting this out there, is that the remains of the weathered or corroded body uh, creates sort of like a wraith of rust flakes, and the wraith says something that foreshadows something to come, right?
Yeah, I like that.
Wrote it. Dungeoneer speaks a warning of a danger to come.
What if also, just to add a little bit more to that, what
Mm-hmm.
if not only is it just the corroded dungeoneer, but what if like what the dungeoneer dusts into mixes with the dust that's already there? So it's not just the dust of the one that just died, but maybe it's like the last bit of dust needed to create the wraith mixed
Sure.
with like the stuff that's already in the room.
Perfect. Mixed with corrosive element, forming a corroded rust wraith that speaks a warning of a danger to come.
That's fucking dope. That's
See, I mean, so
sick.
we've just done one of these. It's only been a few minutes. Did you feel the same jolt that I felt of excitement,
Yeah,
or is that just me?
that's
Is
so
that just my
dope.
medicine
That's
kicking in? You
so
know?
no, that's fucking. I mean, the Red Bull is kicking in. I'm gonna say, but
Yeah.
that's so fucking dope. See, this is what I love about what we're doing. We're 3 episodes in, but every exercise that you're showing, having me go through, they're all connected. Like we're using the words we came up with in episode 1, in episode 3, and it all ties itself together. But like you said, like a lot of dungeon design would just be like, here's a cool death, like, and then that's it. You're just like, all right, the person died, now go find the wax or
Yeah.
whatever. This is like, and like, yes, and and it's just mm,
Yeah, and it's
mm,
fulfilling. I'm gonna slide back to slide 5 really quick here. Um this fits that rewarding
right,
block here. Because again, what we're trying to do, going back to Jesper Jewel again, is how can we encourage the players to take what could be a moment of frustration that their player character has died and turn it from something that's annoying for them and instead make it a cool, memorable moment. Because if your character walks in, we've all played dungeons like this, you walk into the room, you save, you die, and your body decomposes, and it's like, okay, depending on the player, that by itself could be satisfying, but for a lot of players, you might need to give them something more, and especially if you want to
right.
design a death trap dungeon that really is memorable. So yeah, we've taken what is a mundane death and sprinkled a little reward on top of it. And the hope is that when players experience this, they're going to go from this moment of frustration, like, oh shit, the thief went in without the wax and her body corroded to rust. But then her wraith comes back and speaks some warning of a future thing, and it's like, oh
Yeah,
shit, that's cool. And it also helps
that's
them. It gives them, a little bit of something that they can use to succeed in the future. Does that make sense?
yeah, no, absolutely. And like that is, it's interesting that it is rewarding, and it's interesting to think about it in that way, where like, because yeah, if I walked in and instantly just eroded and fucking died, I'd be like, God fucking damn it. And then
Yeah.
if my bits mixed with other bits in this room and formed a wraith that then spoke to me, I'd be like, oh shit. That would be
Yeah,
so cool, you know, like the roller coaster that that would give me. Like, mm, mm.
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah, so and again, that's really where I feel like Death First Design has been helpful for me, and why I really felt like I enjoyed Deathtrap Dungeon design a lot more once I kind of had this realization that it wasn't enough to just do. I don't want to pick on them because I don't really know a whole lot about it, but the death save type stuff, where it's like, okay, let's just turn the DCs up, and that is, for me, that's not sufficient. This is really where the money is.
yeah.
That's just my opinion. All
I
right,
mean,
so you ready to
yeah,
do
I
a?
share the opinion for sure. Yeah.
So let's see. You ready to do a
Um,
next one?
fuck yeah, let's do this thing.
All right. So go ahead
Um,
and roll a
shit.
d12, and I went ahead and
Oh,
deleted the ones that we've already done.
so
Oh, neat.
that's 100. So I got 10.
So that is acid etch, or why am I typing the wrong spot? Here we go. So etch. God damn it, H2. Come on. Etch with acid or engrave. Ooh, that's
Right.
cooking. I rolled 5, which is unleash or worsen a threat.
Ooh. Okay, so I like this because we've talked about the acid. Where is that when we talked about the acid one? Did we sarcophagus, metal shards, urn, protective wax, hidden tomb above? I feel like we talked about. No, that's the dust acid. I feel like maybe we didn't write it down or just brought it up, but like the potential of something like dripping or doing something where it either acid engraves a new thing or reveals something by the acid melting part of stuff away.
Yeah,
So I like the idea of, I don't know where your head's at, but potentially um however this person dies, you know, if we do have like the acid dust that we were talking about, or potentially literally just like acid pours on them, it
yeah,
like it either etches a warning into something, or if this is unleash or worse than a threat, it could actually like eat through like a door or a wall or something like that to release something else,
I love it.
um or empower something by etching like a sigil on the ground or something, you know what I mean, like that's
Yeah,
already there but it like completes it because it's been like scuffed over or something like that. What are you
yeah.
thinking?
So my first thought was jumping back to the skeletons in rusted armor that pull their visors up and spray acid and rusting gas.
Oh
So my
yeah.
thinking was you've got so armored death knights, open visor to spray acid on death. A character in heavy armor has a sigil etched uh on their armor, right? And this sigil is a buffing rune for the knight.
Oh, that's awesome. So these are the knights that breathe like the rusting gas.
Yeah, I'm picturing like it just sprays like an acid breath weapon. So you got like these fully enclosed Death Knights, very Dark Souls. They lift open their visor, acid sprays out in a cone. If you're killed by it and you were wearing heavy armor when you died, it etches a sigil on your armor, and the sigil's a buffing rune. And then depending on your game system, you might even randomize from the symbol spells in the game, because like D&D has a lot of like different symbol spells that can be used to buff or even
Right.
frighten enemies. So you might even like add a little extra layer on there and say, okay, the fighter died and her armor, her breastplate or her shield got something engraved on it by the acid that killed her, go ahead and roll on this little table of all the different like symbol spells. It could be like, oh shit, now there's a symbol of confusion or a symbol of death or symbol of fear or one that shields. You know what I'm saying? Like the
Yeah, that's what's
possibilities are
up.
really kind of endless here.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That's really dope.
Oh yeah. And again, it's hopefully the people who are watching are getting a good sense as well of like, oh, okay, I see how this is making death more entertaining and not just like this thing where it's like, okay, your adventure's coming to an end. Sorry, you know.
Yeah, well, because again, like it's an and. Like
Yeah.
it's not just you die, it's you die and that's like it's always great to do like a yes and or a yes but or a no and or a no but. Like they're just it's just good design. Like as you said, that's not the end, right? It's not just you died. And the cool thing too is like as characters die, they're gonna start to expect that and, right?
Yeah. And
So
you
they're
create the tension, you know?
yeah. Well, and not only that, it's not just the tension, it's that it's like a Pavlov's dog thing too. You know what I mean? It is a reward. It is a reward, even if it's or it's something more, right? People aren't gonna have that like shit I died like after once or twice and they realize there's always gonna be something a little bit more. It's gonna be like I died. Okay, what? Like what happens this time? What happens this time? You know what I mean? There's
Yeah.
always like a level of excitement almost for dying in that there's more to it always. You know?
And what you've just described is literally us resolving the paradox of failure in a death trap dungeon, right? Because that's what Jesper Jules talking about. Is like, okay, clearly, you know, games are in the business of making us fail, and we want to avoid failure. But then, why are we drawn to these things? Why do we have people who are like super gung ho about Dark Souls or Death Trap dungeons? It's because of what you just described. We resolved the paradox in a very entertaining way. And yeah, to jump back to slide 5 real quick, you know what we've done here is created a spectacular. That's kind of where I would categorize this one is, you know, it's not really rewarding the players, it's making their lives harder, but it's
Mm-hmm.
just so over the top. Like, really? Like I died and then my armor got etched with a symbol of pain and it's hurting. It's just, yeah, it's just one of those things where even if you're bummed about rolling a nat one and getting, you know, dissolved by the night, I mean, hell, it's super fun. I can't remember who this was. I think it was some random tweet I saw forever ago. They were talking about like 2d6 systems like Dungeon World and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they talked about how they loved rolling like 6 or less. And I think I think the tweet even was like, "Hell yeah, fuck me up, totally ruin me." You know what I mean? Like
Yep.
people,
Yeah.
and that's how I am when I play these games. Like, you know,
Oh
you want
yeah.
to play to succeed. I mean, that's what, you know, I keep coming back to it, but the sports psychology stuff that Jesper Jewell was talking about in Art of Failure, where it's like you want to play to win, you want to do your best, but you should primarily be playing just for the love of the game, and that there are other goals here. And part of the fun of playing a Death Trap dungeon is seeing your character come to kind of a grisly, wild demise. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean that is what I mean that's what's fun too, you know. And the other thing too, I mean, Dark Souls, Blasphemous, all those games too. The more times you fail, the more rewarding it is when you finally succeed. Like that's
100%.
that's the core to me is just like I died 50 times fighting this guy, so when I do finally beat him, I remember literally when we were doing because I was streaming Blasphemous, there was a death counter, and I was like, I will beat this boss before I get to 69 deaths.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
like it was a great time.
Yeah, and like, you know, players definitely have a variety of tastes, but I'm a big believer in the challenge creates those high highs and those low lows. Like for me, like especially Elden Ring, like there was a lot of moments of that game that were genuinely tremendously frustrating that I had to kind of walk away from it for a day or two and then come back. But I tell you, man, like when you get past those moments, it is a high like nothing else. Like it's the only game. Like my neighbors must hate me because I am like I'll beat a boss and I will be going nuts, you
Yeah.
know.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't want to sound self-aggrandizing because I hate that, but I remember when I started doing fourth edition Death Trap Dungeon stuff, and people would send me messages and they go, "This is the first time that I've ever seen people stand and cheer during a D&D game. And it came down to just the high stakes and the tension and the fun of overcoming, these overcoming that failure, right? Having that failure happen again and again and again. But again, it's not punishing, but it's all, you know, part of the vibe of just like, okay, we're getting our ass kicked, but we overcome it eventually. Anyway, let's do a third one, and then we'll start bringing the chat in, and they can roll for us because that's been pretty fun. Who do we have repping in the chat tonight? You said Andy's around.
I think Andy actually pieced out. I don't feel like we got too many. Yeah, I feel like we started late on a night that wasn't normal, and I don't think Janelle and Jason are around, so it might be you and me for tonight.
I like it. All right. Well, for the folks who are watching, like the VOD or the YouTube, definitely post in Discord, your thoughts and, if you found it helpful and ideas that you came up with. We can definitely pop those in the doc.
Leave some comments on the VOD,
Yeah, do it up.
So I got an 8. So we got Decay and Rot, which is a fucking big one. That's a big one.
All right. Yeah, it's a solid one. Let's see here. Let's re-roll that. I already rolled that one. Here we go. So you got Decay/Rot. Is that right?
Right. Uh-huh.
And then I got Reveal a Secret.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Because we've talked about some of this stuff before. Not the curses and mental deterioration, sarcophagus. Oh, the metal shards in the sarcophagus is dope. Urn and protective wax. So, I mean, what immediately comes to mind is the most straightforward one is something will rot away and reveal something beneath, right? Like, so that's. But this is character death, so a character will decay or rot away in some way.
Yeah.
Somehow revealing.
Or it could be an action that led to a character's death. So perhaps the player characters were themselves trying to cause something to rot or delay, or trying to stave off rot or decay. They failed, and this effect happens. Or the characters die, and then it causes something else to decay or rot, which in turn reveals a secret, right?
Yeah. So, gosh, that's so dependent on how the character dies. So we have the acid dust. We have the ghost specter. Oh, I really like the ghost specter that has the patina touch.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's good. I feel like they're not dying with the patina touch, but that kind of concept where maybe like, I'm curious if maybe there should be something inside the character that they don't know is there.
It's a possibility.
Like maybe upon entering, like we talked about at some point, like putting it, like having a time limit on this, and like once the characters enter the dungeon, like something happens, right? That reveals to them in some way that they have X amount of time, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking in my head, like, so we have the mini game. The unique mechanic we have is the skeleton pieces, right?
Yeah.
And basically, we also talked about like the NPCs and stuff. I think some messages in Discord. I don't know if we talked about them afterwards, about like the possibility of like the NPCs in there and whatnot. But I'm curious, what if we did something that was like, when the players, go back into the dungeon, they realize they have like 3 hours or something. But it's like,
Yeah.
why, But what
Yeah.
if one time when the character rots away, there is like some mark on their bones, or like their bones are rusted like some of these or something, you know?
Yeah.
Like
That
a
reveals a
sigil like on their skull they didn't see before or something, you know?
yeah.
So they were branded, but it was like inside and they didn't realize it until like literally their flesh rotted away. And then they saw um this sigil on them and realized that like maybe this is, what's causing their death in 3 hours or something.
Yeah. I like that.
Um
I'm gonna put those notes down. My thoughts. I'm kind of looking over our elements from the previous episode. Is the crypt thing, the iron crypt thing? It was like the iron bones of the priestess who was left behind,
yes.
right?
Yep.
Where you can kind of borrow a bone. So my thinking is that when a player decays or rots, maybe you might know. So what do you call the substance that's left behind by rotten flesh? Is there a term? Is there a medical term for that?
Well, I mean, so what?
Because
I mean, I guess it
here's my thinking,
depends.
right?
Do you mean the flesh
Um,
specifically?
could be the flesh, could be the bones that rot away. Because what I'm thinking is the NPC uh, states that she will, or that she can consume, swallow, breathe the rotted remains of a human being to get a premonition about a secret. So you can bring it back to her and say, "Hey, here's like the rotten remains of our companion that died." And this undead, like iron priestess skeleton goes, "Okay." And she just, snorts or consumes this substance and
Yeah.
has a vision that she reveals to the characters, like, "Oh, I have a vision, a memory of my life. There's a secret shrine over here." Does that make sense?
Yeah, she just rips a line of dead people and she's
Pretty
like,
much.
ah, you know what
Yeah,
this NPC
100%.
reminds me of a little bit, probably not in a way, but like we could almost have this be a thing too, maybe. What's the name of the NPC in Blasphemous where like every time you get her help she ages?
Oh, I know who you're talking about. Yeah. The
Yeah.
I have to look her up. NPC
That
that
would be
age.
that would be dope if something like that happened here, where like maybe if she did consume the flesh and get a vision, next time you saw her, like she was a little like decayed, because like she could say like you could do this more than once, like bring
Yeah.
back the flesh and I'll consume it, and like she's okay, but then after when they come back like the second time, she's already like she's rotting, and
Yeah.
then when they get it the second time she's rotting some more, so maybe there's like an unknown to them like number of times she can do this, and every time she does, she actually rots and could potentially like rot away and die.
Yeah. Viridiana was her name.
Yeah, that was such a
Yeah.
dude. That hurt me when I realized that like I really wanted her help because I was underleveled for the boss, and
Yeah.
then spoiler alert for Blasphemous, amazing game, go play it. And then I came back and she had aged, and I was like, God damn it! Like, but now I've done
Yeah.
it already. I'm gonna do it again.
Yeah, I
So
lost my
that one,
mind. I was like, "Oh man, I fucked
oh,
up."
that hurt so bad. Uh, all right. Anyway, oh, obviously that's a much better idea than mine, and I love the idea of like having her be like a potentially recurrent NPC by using that mechanic.
Yeah, and what it does, I don't want to get too far ahead because we'll talk about some of the stuff in a future episode, but we can also use these opportunities to introduce choices. So it's like, okay, maybe there's multiple ways that the characters can use the rotted remains of their allies. Maybe there's two NPCs that provide different benefits, or you know what I'm saying? Like there's these can be just a starting point for even more interesting
Right.
interactions that we could design.
Yeah.
Um,
Remind
so
me. Remind me to talk off stream about a little bit of that,
yeah, totally.
because I mean
Um,
we're gonna get to this in a later episode, so you guys don't get to hear it later.
that's right.
All right.
So do you think there's enough people in the chat who can throw a D12 or a D8 for us?
Probably I don't really see a whole lot of people conversing, just a lot of lurkers it looks like. So I think it's just
Sure.
you and me.
Cool. Let's go ahead and let's do it again.
All right. I got 7 dissolve.
Interesting. I got 2 make a dramatic roll.
Ooh.
So what do I mean by make a dramatic roll? So a dramatic roll can be a couple of things. It could be a saving throw with a really significant consequence for failure, right? Like a death save, but doesn't have to be death. It could be some other significant setback. It can be the randomization. So for like how we talked about the sigil thing earlier on, where a random symbol could appear. What
Right.
I often like to do is create weighted tables and then tell the players the stakes. It's like, okay, I'm gonna roll a d6 here. On a 1, 2, 3, it's gonna be this like lesser symbol. It'll still suck for you, but it's not gonna be the worst thing in the world. And then on a 5 or 6, it's gonna be like a medium symbol. And then if I roll a 6, you're in real trouble, right? So that's an example of
Right.
a dramatic roll where you tell the players the stakes and then you roll, and that can you kind of go from there. So what do you think? And so dissolve, I mean, we've used method of death, we've used action that led to death, effect that happens because of death. But then making a dramatic roll, I mean, what are you feeling on this one?
Well, real quick, we actually just got raided by J- Jehananon, I believe is who it was. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank
We
you.
are we're doing what's called Seance. It's Deathtrap dungeon design, and right now we are mixing some verbs we came up with on an earlier episode with various ways to make death more interesting. Currently mixing dissolve because our Deathtrap dungeon is a tomb with a corroding theme. With making a dramatic roll. So, could you explain dramatic roll again, real quick, one more time, just
Yeah,
for
so a dramatic roll could be something like a saving throw with a significant consequence for failure. So that could be death or some other major setback thematic to the dungeon. It could be randomization. So I talked about weighted tables, like, okay, there may be 3 different negative results from least bad to most bad, and you're going to roll in front of the players and let them know, hey, if I roll 1, 2, 3, it's going to be bad but not horrible, but if I roll a 6, you're in serious trouble. Again,
right,
any
right, right,
dramatic roll is one where the players are like shutting up and watching what the
right.
die is going to come up, right?
Mm-hmm. So, I feel like I think smaller than you think in some of these things. What immediately comes to me with a weighted dissolve table could literally be for example, I think one of the earlier things we had was this like giant mouth.
Yeah.
There was like a skull skeleton rust, but like so we kind of converted the skeleton knights to do, instead of breathing rusting gas, to do more of like an acid cone. But I
Yeah.
still like the idea of like the giant mouth that like opens and breathes some type of like corroding gas. I kind of like the idea of what if it was something like that, and if it's a weighted table, like the low roll could be like, each of you pick an item, it's corroded away completely.
Yeah.
um and then like the worst of that could be like anyone within the cone, you're all just like dissolved into fucking dust, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's beyond corroding individual items. It's now, you are all in this breath. Anyone that was too close, you all take the brunt of it.
Yeah.
I kind of like the way that tied into that a little bit.
Check this out. Let's see how you feel about this. Because you
Mhm.
gave me a really great idea. I love this idea of the weighted table, the giant mouth skull that breathes. That's always good. I'm a big fan of like faces and skulls in the wall. Here's what I'm thinking: weighted table, roll a d10 on a roll of a 1 through a 5. One item in the immediate area is dissolved. On a 6 through 8, all items in the immediate area are dissolved. And then check this out. Let's see how this sits with you. Sorry, 6 to 9. On a 10, All metal items in the dungeon are dissolved.
Oh, fuck.
And this, of course, would be like probably like a one-shot trap, like it'd be a real big fuck up
Yeah.
for the players. But how does that feel? So that yeah, you're basically rolling. I try to put like metal items. So one metal, all metal items. And that becomes a dramatic roll where, it's weighted. So the chances are it's either going to be one item is dissolved, and then on a 6 to 9, all the items in the immediate area, or we can say like in the cone, are dissolved. But then 10 could be like this, there's all these faces that open up throughout the dungeon, or just cloud just supernaturally fills the space, and every metal item, unless it's been protected by wax, right?
Right.
How does that sit with you?
I really like this. My only question with this, I feel like some items would have to be immune, because did we make the bones that were returning like rusted metal,
Oh yeah, we did
or
do a
did
little
we
bit
make
with
them
that. Yeah,
bones? Yeah.
yeah,
So
I
we
think
could
they
just
were
make
iron.
them.
Yeah,
We could just make them basically.
yeah,
Well, no, because if we talked about, yeah, I was gonna say if non-magical, because those are clearly magical,
yeah.
then and if a dungeoneer somehow happens to have like +1 longsword or whatever, like, but the like we're not giving them that, so like they're not really gonna have that. But like armor, I mean, like, that's crazy. But I love the idea that, but maybe being like a, gosh, like 1 to 5 is basically like a burp, and then like 6 to
Yeah.
9 is like a cough, but 10 is literally like and they see it
Yeah.
like not just fill the room but like pour out of the room. And then I love the idea of them going through and seeing like just the rusted out chunks of metal for like the entire rest of the dungeon, like, and how that would affect so many things. I mean, if there are torch brackets on the wall, those would be rusted off the wall. Like armor on like bad guys would be gone too. Like you could even have like
Yeah.
bridges gone because they had like chain railings or something like that. But like, and um all you would see is the rusted remains of all of the shit that went wrong. Like, I would definitely, if we were gonna have like notes for the GM in here, I would definitely have them
Yeah.
like play that up for the rest of the thing. Like, oh, here is where you could have had this, but like it got rusted away.
100%. And
I
I like what you mentioned here is we could lean on back to slide 5. We have a spectacular death, right? It's like, oh man, there's a trap that dissolves every non-magical metal item in the area. But we can also make it rewarding. Like we can cut the failure with a reward, and that can be okay, yeah, I mean you roll the 10 and a bunch of items got destroyed, but also enemy armor got destroyed, right? So there's a little bit of a reward there. So yeah, we have this giant skull as a result of a character dying in its presence. It opens up, it like it absorbs its soul or something, spits this dissolving gas. You roll this thing, and yeah, I like what you did here because that gives us a little. I want to make actually a note here to come back to this later. Oh wait, is it picking the right spot? I don't know why it selected Golem for me. That's goofy. But we can use this in a later episode, right? Like, okay, we have some kind of trap here that could just destroy bridges or doors, or certain enemies. And let's see here, back later. Anyway, so why don't we do one more? Round it out with 5.
Okay.
That sound good?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, here we go.
Ooh, man, give me a fucking roll here. I literally, like, all I've rolled is high rolls, and I've literally rolled 8 4 times,
There you go.
and then a 10, and an 8 again.
There we go.
Fuck, and a 2. All right, dude, I've only rolled 3 times, and then I just rolled all of those 3 like 8 times. Really doesn't want me to have low numbers. So I got a 2. I got Mourn. That's a good
There
one.
we go. So you got Mourn, and I got Make a Hard Choice.
Ooh, yeah. That's going to be a good one.
So that gives us a lot of opportunities here. So there's a couple different kinds of hard choices. I'm pretty sure that we will be talking about choices as part of a whole episode later on. But really quickly here, there's a couple different kinds of choices. There's mutually exclusive choice. So that means there's two options. Neither one is right or wrong or better or worse. They just have their own unique benefits and drawbacks, right? And so the players have to think, okay, which one appeals to us the most due to our play style, our play strategy, what we've accomplished so far in the dungeon and what we think we need, or what we anticipate coming later and what we might want to like protect against. There's risk versus reward. So there's an option of a lower risk, lower reward choice, or a higher risk, higher reward choice. There's a couple other types, but I think we will stick with those two for now. Yeah, what are you thinking on this one? What pops to mind when you see Mourn plus hard choice?
Man,
And again, it
I
could be a method
feel
of death. So the player mourns themselves to death. Action that leads to death. So maybe they mourned incorrectly and were struck down. Or, the obvious one is an effect that happens because the player character died. So the player character perishes, and there's some kind of mourning that happens. You know what I'm saying?
I really love the idea of the dual NPC in this dungeon.
Okay.
And I
Yeah.
feel like opposed NPCs. We talked about the potential of like this female priestess, and we also talked about the potential of like the bones were returning, were
Yeah.
like high priests of like a god, right? Or like
Yeah.
a fallen like lich or something, right? So like in my head, a little. I'll talk about the headcanon of that later. But I love the idea of these
Love it.
these two NPCs in the dungeon with two
Yeah.
opportunities to um get help, and it really depends on if you're leaning towards what in my mind feels like the good guys or the bad guys, kind of.
Yeah.
And I love the idea of the bad guy being the one that eats the flesh to give you a vision.
Yeah.
And I love the idea of the good guy being this priestess that you can go to mourn your fallen comrade at,
Yeah.
to do something, right? So
Right.
like, and by doing so, I feel like it would be interesting to make the flesh-eating bad guy like an easier path, and
Okay.
have the female priestess, the good person, be almost like a more difficult path. Kind of, does that make sense? Like, I like the whole concept of like take the easy way out versus this other way, where like it might
Yeah.
feel like it's harder, but in the end be more rewarding, or actually give you a bigger reward at like the final boss or something.
Yeah. So you're thinking maybe
So
like a risk versus reward choice where we have, a player character that dies.
right,
There's some kind of interaction where we can take, I'm thinking of like more, or like you can ask them to eulogize the character.
yeah, yeah.
There we go. Ask
Um,
NPC to eulogize, perhaps like in the name of their specific deity, right?
right,
And then
right, right,
maybe
right.
okay, there's the lich that's a less risky choice, but with a lesser reward, or you can go to the priestess, which is like a riskier choice. We'll kind of work out what the risk is in a second. But if the mourning is successful or whatever it does, you get a bigger boon. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I like. So how do you feel about maybe like it's almost like it's risk versus reward, but it's also like a now versus later choice that they might not even be aware of at the time, right?
Yeah.
So like if they go to the guy that will eat the rotten flesh of their fallen comrade, right away they get like this premonition or something, or some boon or something like that. But if they take the um character instead to this priestess who mourns them. Maybe they don't even really get something that's evident now,
Yeah.
but when they get to the final boss, there is something that is easier, like some mechanic that is helping them in that room,
Yeah.
because they went to the that person instead. Almost like there's an ability in Blasphemous where you can like you can you basically become immune for like 30 seconds or whatever. Do you know what I'm talking
Oh
about?
yeah. Yeah,
Like
that's a big
almost,
move with the final boss.
yeah, it's almost kind of like that, where maybe like, when the final battle starts, like some voice enters their head or some light shines down and like lets them know that they made the right choice earlier in the dungeon, and here is the boon that they get.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna write these down here. Deferred effect based on eulogy and final boss. So what's the element of risk here, right? We're kind of going with a risk versus reward choice. Um, Presumably we're asking the NPC to eulogize the fallen player character in the name of their specific deity. So I'm
Uh-huh.
wondering if maybe like the first thing that comes to mind for me is the risk is, will the deity accept the dead, right? Like, okay, is this person that the NPC is eulogizing worthy of the deity's blessing? Does that make sense?
Right.
And this can
What
depend on different factors. It could be like um, role playing or actions taken earlier in the adventure or that kind of thing.
what if by, and tell me if this is actually a risk or reward choice and there's still this deferred choice too. What if
Yeah.
by morning they receive some type of like token from the priestess,
Yeah.
but that token will actually make other parts of the dungeon more difficult? Like creatures will target them more, like more random encounters, like it actually puts a target on their back. So it's like, it's not really risk versus reward. I mean, I guess it is, but they don't know about the reward is what is the
Yeah.
difficult part of it.
Well, I mean, you would
Um,
telegraph that to them, is you would just say, okay, a telegraphed option to have the NPC priestess eulogize, I can't spell again, eulogize a fallen player character. Because risk reward is, okay, do we get this reward, but at the cost of higher risk, right? That's
right,
the greater risk, greater reward, choice.
right,
Um, and this benefit, they get a boon useful in the final battle, or they opt not to eulogize, right? So
right,
it's less risk because they're attracting less danger, but they don't have the reward in the final battle that they could use
right.
to get an edge, right? Does that make sense?
And the inverse of that could be that, if they go with the quote unquote bad route, it could be the dungeon could be somewhat easier for them going through, but
Yeah.
when they get to the final boss, maybe the boss is actually harder because of the actions that they took, because they actually
Yeah,
gave
exactly right.
rotten flesh to like his high priestess or something like that, and it could actually have like powered up the final boss in some way. So it's almost like make
Yeah.
the dungeon harder but the final boss a little bit easier, or make the dungeon easier and the final boss a little bit harder. Both of
Yeah.
those options at the end are like deferred choices that they don't know about till later, which I think is cool, but also allows a risk versus reward choice for now, where they realize I could do nothing, or I could go make the dungeon harder now for me, or go to the bad guy and make it actually easier now for me. So it's
Yeah.
a now versus later and kind of a risk versus reward.
100%. And yeah, really the essence of risk versus reward is being able to kind of adjust the difficulty level of the adventure, but in doing so, like you turn the difficulty down, you're turning the rewards down, um, and vice versa. You turn the difficult, like you're opting into more difficulty. That means you're going to get more rewards out of it. Um,
But
so
what
I,
were you thinking for this one, or is that good? Is that good for you?
yeah, I think this is solid. I mean, um, I like the idea of having the fallen player character be mourned by an NPC, and that choice of like, do we have an NPC mourn them, or do we pick which NPC does the eulogy, because that could change the nature of the benefit. One thing I was thinking too was like, depending on the traits of the character, right? Like, okay, if you eulogize a fighter, that's going to be different from eulogizing a thief, and that could affect. But you can only mourn once, right?
Yeah.
So that becomes a now, or it becomes a yeah, it's a now versus later choice. But essentially, it's okay. We had the rogue die like in the first hour. Do we want to go take advantage of the once per game mourning to get the benefit out of the rogue? Or do we wait and okay, now the fighter died later and we want really her benefit? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. You know what's going to crack me up, though? Because if enough people play this, if they go, oh, wait, we get a benefit for dying, you know? Like, all right, more,
Yeah.
and, you know?
Yeah, well that's I mean that's something that we'll talk about later in the series, but you do build in essentially like a lose condition. I mean, typically it's like number of deaths, right?
Right.
So that's what Chapel of Grief, my newer module, works, where there are moments where the characters, when they die, there is some kind of consolation prize or way that they can turn it into a reward, but there's still a maximum number of deaths that they can suffer. There's a maximum, but the way it works in the module is that their grief becomes so total that they just collapse, right, in misery.
Right.
Um, in tournament modules, so I think the scoring system for Necropolis of the Mailed Fist and a lot of my older ones, like, you can die, you respawn, but you lose points every time you do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when you're playing competitively, it's like, okay, yeah, I mean, and that actually becomes part of the calculus. It becomes part of the hard choice of, do we want to eat a death here to potentially get a reward later? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, people did that when we were running Mailed Fist too, especially when we got to the final boss. Like, because I think, like I said, if I remember correctly, like, we would let players just not do death saves and just take a death. And when you got to the final boss, it was like, okay, we're going to gain a shitload of points if we beat them. So is it worth just, as soon as you hit 0, just saying I'm dead and coming back the next turn? Or is it worth trying to be down a player or sometimes 2 as people are making death saving throws, and then the boss is still just, raining havoc on, like, you're not able to focus fire with like 5 people when you only have like 2 people up or whatever. So it got to a point where people were literally like, nope, I'm dead, let's go, and people were just like dropping points like crazy trying to knock the final boss down. So it definitely goes into the calculus pretty quickly when people are like, no, like, I'll do all my death saves early on, and by the end they're like, nope, let's go, I'm dead, I'm dead. So
yeah, and that definitely, depending on what game system you're doing, like, in something like D&D where you have the buffer of the death saving throws, like we talked about early in the episode, you might just say, hey, for this adventure, you die when you get to 0. I mean, that's often why anytime I do a Deathtrap dungeon, there's a time limit, there's a death limit, and there's some other things as well to help head off like degenerate play strategies, right? Where it's like, okay, if there's no penalty for dying at all, then there's really no reason for us to not just keep like killing ourselves to get, like, you get these weird degenerate play strategies, and it's not what you want, right? And we talk about that a lot, and that's what game design is trying to create systems, rule systems, mechanics, interactions that encourage players to go towards the most fun play strategies. And I want to say Jesper Jewell in Art of Failure talks about that a little bit. So I really, before we wrap up, I want to jump back really quick to slide 5. I know there might be some people coming in who didn't get a chance to see this, but the big takeaway from tonight's episode is that when you're designing a Deathtrap dungeon, I invite you to not just leave it at, okay, the player character dies, but rather, how can you take something that's a frequent occurrence in a Deathtrap dungeon that can sometimes be frustrating and turn it into something spectacular, right? With like something that's particularly gruesome or wild. Like, I don't know about you, but these deaths sound pretty sick that we came up with tonight.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
really fucking cool. Engaging. So like we talked about, you can turn their deaths into interesting choices or role-playing moments. Like, you're essentially taking a character's death and turning it into an opportunity for interesting gameplay. And then finally, you can just do what I call like a consolation prize, where the player character dies, but through their death, the players earn some kind of reward. So that being said, is there any last words you want to get in on this, Ryan, before we talk about, what's coming up next and plug some of our stuff?
No, I think this was a super fun one. I mean, the other thing too is we only went with 5 of these. I mean, there's a lot of other options here where we could continue off stream or as
Oh
we
yeah.
go through being able to come back. I mean, there's 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 8 more verbs and 3 more options here. That we can continue to do this, and it just feels cool. Like we talked about, like just having the yes and or whatever and option. It every one of these feels better than just like fuck it, like you're dead, just respawn and keep going. And it's a really
Yeah.
cool thing to do. And again, I love how every episode we're bringing in things from the previous episode, because it's going to make it feel so cohesive at the end. I feel like we're just going to get to a point where it's like almost building itself. It's just like go back and use what you've already done and then just extrapolate it in this like slightly different way, and now you're going to have all of these other options to use. And been a really neat series of exercises to do with you. So this has been really neat.
Oh, 100%. And that's, I'm glad to hear that, because that's what we talked about in the very first episode, which, if there are folks in the chat who are just tuning in for the first time, this is our third episode. The very first episode, we kind of gave an introduction to the stream series and what our goals were. And one of them was helping people have a process for designing adventures, because I know a lot of people sit down and they go, okay, maybe I have some vague ideas floating around, but I don't really know where to start or how to go about dungeon design in a sort of structured and intentional and mindful way. Like, I'm hoping, even though we're only 3 episodes of 12 in, do you feel, Ryan, like already, like, okay, I'm a process is crystallizing here. Like, when you
Oh yeah.
in the future, when you go to design, I mean, hopefully you'll feel like this is a process that you can take with you in the future.
Oh yeah. And the other thing too is, like, I've read so many of your uh adventure design stuff. I'm not going to get into some of the stuff that I know we're going to talk about later, but like there's a bunch of stuff I've read where I'm like, this is going to make dungeon design easier, especially when there's like certain, again, I'm not going to, there's specific words I'm avoiding right now. But this, I feel like, provides even more structure for a lot of the things that you've already talked about on like Storytelling Collective with a lot of your courses and stuff, where, being able to bring in a lot of those other things into this structure, because this is talking about things happening, but we're also like talking about even just like the theme of the dungeon and putting that together, and how then you can tie that into, as you talked about, like deaths and monsters and like all sorts of different ways to keep it super cohesive. And again, just build on each layer.
Yeah.
It's I feel like we're getting to a point where it's just like, here's fucking badass dungeon design for dummies, like, just do this, and it just feels good. Like it just feels really clever and really contained and really cohesive. So yeah, I'm learning so much from this, and even just knowing what the titles are from here, I can see where this process is heading, and I'm super excited to get to later episodes.
Yeah, I'm pumped up. The last thing I'll say before I give a little preview of next episode is, um, I really love the Deathtrap dungeon genre. And I'm not the kind of person that's like, it's the only way, it's the best way. But for me, it's my favorite. And as such, I want to share it with people, and I want other people to enjoy it. And I think, unfortunately, for I think legit reasons, Death Trap Dungeon or Killer Dungeons get kind of a bad rap. And I think what we talked about tonight is a big reason that it just feels like the DM is just stamping her boot on your face forever. And
Yep.
really, it's like, no, what we're doing here is, the point is for the death to be fun and spectacular and engaging and rewarding. And so my hope is, you know, if people can take some of these concepts away, and as I said at the beginning of the stream series, like, take what you like and discard what you don't. Think of this as like a buffet of different techniques that you can use. But hopefully, that just results in more fun Death Trap dungeons put out by other people, so that more folks can enjoy the genre in the way that you and I enjoy it.
Yeah. I mean, and this is exactly I've talked to a lot of people that don't want to play the style of play because they feel like, as you said, it's punishing, not rewarding.
Yeah.
And you just get to a point where you're just like, you feel like it's just a grind and not like a fun, not like a meat grind, and that's not fun.
Right.
But you're just like, all right, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing? And this is such a better way to do that, where there's more to it, and making death feel rewarding is such a huge part. Because I mean, at the end of the day, as we said with like Dark Souls and Blasphemous and stuff like that, it doesn't matter if you die a million times, eventually you do succeed and you feel rewarded for it. Like, you have to have that peace, or it just becomes a slog you're gonna put down,
Absolutely. So on that note, what have you got cooking up? You want to pitch some of the other stuff that's going on the channel?
Yeah, I mean, listen, if you're here watching this right now, it's only on YouTube right now until I actually get the podcast up and going. So you've probably seen the Weekly Scroll podcast, which is where we do, just game reviews. We've been doing a shit ton of interviews. It's currently Zemo. In the future, when this is on the podcast, this will be on the Adventure Archive podcast. So go check us out on the Weekly Scroll podcast, where we do game reviews and interviews with creators, and occasionally some actual plays. And also, if you're listening, you're probably going to see some actual plays on the podcast too, where we've run Merkborg, and we're going to be running Cyborg here soon. So just check out all the rest of our stuff. And that's about what I got.
Awesome. So for me, you can find my most recent published modules at koboldpress.com. My most recent ones are Necropolis of the Mailed Fist and Tomb of Mercy. I do have some new stuff coming out with Kobold Press in the near future, so join their mailing list to get plugged in on that. You can also find my work at sersavictory.itch.io, kind of a new platform for me, where I'm sharing more like BX, OSR type stuff. I'm participating in Dungeon 23, where I'm writing one module every single month for 2023. So I've got my first one up there for free, along with some other resources. You can also find my online courses about dungeon design and creative writing at storytellingcollective.com. I have a new class coming out next week. It is not RPG related, it's creative writing related. I can't say what yet, but if you join their mailing list, you'll get notified, and we're really excited about that. And pop in. We do this every Tuesday night around 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, barring illness and things like that. So yeah, join the feed and join us next time. We love chat participation. So
super great. Yeah, and next week we will it is, for those watching, it is Wednesday. We usually do it yesterday, but we will be doing it next Tuesday. So yeah, super excited.
Yeah.
Do we want to announce what the theme is next week?
Hell yeah. So on slide 6, we had these little interactions on the right-hand side that we combined with our verbs to make a death. And I didn't just pick these out of nowhere. These are examples of what I call dungeon crawl moments. So there's a set of iconic moments that people play dungeon adventures to experience. And in our next episode, we're going to talk about moment-driven design, and we're going to brainstorm different elements of our dungeon that help encourage these iconic dungeon crawling moments. So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, I'm super excited. That's the word I was trying to avoid earlier. So now that you said it, I can say it. So
there you go.
Very, very excited for that. The moments are, reading those, and when I was first introduced to those by you, completely changed the way I view adventures and honestly tabletop RPGs in general. So next week is going to be a really, really fun one. Super excited. Catch us next week again, as we said, 7 p.m. Pacific time. Have a wonderful day, Sersa. Always great time as normal. Very excited for the next 8 to 9 episodes left in this. Damn, we're only a quarter of the way in.
It's already cooking, pumped for this.
It's listen, we're cooking with gas here, and you shouldn't do that anymore. Switch out your gas stoves, people. All right, everyone, have a wonderful night. Sersa, you have a wonderful night, and I mean, we'll talk every day until next Tuesday. But goodbye, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, folks.